I am so thrilled to be back here for another week, another episode of Your Brand Amplified. I'm Annika Jackson, and today my guest is Dr. Andy Neillie of the Neillie Leadership Group. Andy, your slogan is, "We turn managers into leaders." This is so important, and we've been discussing this since we talked about you coming on the show. We haven't had an episode that talks about the difference between managers and leaders. And I know this passion came out of your own experience in the workforce. So I'd love for you to talk a little bit about who you are and how you got to be the person who really creates effective leaders out of managers, because there is such a difference between the two skill sets.
Well, thanks for having me on. I'm so pleased to be with you today. First of all, I just want to celebrate with you, the branding and marketing guru, that I just got back from the trademark office earlier this year, that we actually own that term. We turn managers into leaders. I get to put the little R, registered R, after that phrase. And my executive coach and the mastermind group that I'm a part of, they are blown away that nobody owned that phrase, because there's so much about management and leadership. And I won't even say there's bad thinking, there's lack of clarity, but it's not really anybody's fault, because leadership goes all the way from, the self-leadership of a 4-year-old that you're trying to teach to get up out of bed their own in the morning and start their day without being directed, to the personal leadership movement that we think of people like, Stephen Covey and Tony Robbins. I am passionate about the personal side of leading well, but I'm passionate about it because the impact I've seen it have inside organizations. And really, when people get promoted into management, that doesn't mean they know how to lead. And the challenges they face is where I like to step in and say, folks, it's simple. It's not easy, but it's simple. You've got to think differently.
Yeah, absolutely. So how did you become the guru that you are today, if you don't mind me saying that word, who helps turn managers into leaders? And congratulations, by the way, on your trademark. I think that's so important as part of branding and strategy. Yeah. But so what got you on this journey? Because I'm sure that when you started your career, you weren't saying, "Oh, I'm going to turn managers into leaders."
Yeah. Great question. Well, first of all, I am not a guru on this. I have a tiny little voice to some people who like my voice. There's really not been anything new on leadership since really Marcus Aurelius and Jesus Christ. All of us are simply repeating things that have been said for the last 2,000 years. For me, I think it's a parallel path of 3 different streams of consciousness. The first one is, early on in my career, I just worked for a couple of really bad bosses. In fact, I remember writing a blog probably 7 years ago that was, sometimes your best mentors are your anti-mentors. Even back when I was working my way through college, working construction summers in Phoenix, Arizona. I worked for a swimming pool. We would go from job site to job site throughout the day, doing our electrical prep work for in-ground swimming pools for the Valley of the Sun residential units. And I worked for just a bad boss. I remember the one day we drove from job site to job site, and he was just having a really bad day. He brought his badness to work. At any rate, at one point, I've got to pull together the paperwork after each job site that we then submit to the office for operations and billings. And I'm stapling my package of paper together on the job site we just left. I set my stapler down. Jerry picked up the stapler, opened it up, and proceeded to whack me on the leg with an open stapler, driving these staples into the top of my thigh.
Oh my gosh.
Jerry wasn't just a bad boss. In some respects, Jerry was a bad person, right? And that fire was being stoked. The second path for me, Anika, really has to do with my faith and believing that the whole point of good leadership is to serve the people that you lead. We always have to be careful about that, because there's such strong voices today about employees first. And as somebody who's got more than 100 people working for me right now, I echo that. And I also know I have a stewardship responsibility to the bottom line, so that I get to pay employees next year and the
Exactly.
following year. And so that balance of leadership, while it's simple, it's not easy at times, because you've got to be wise about how you lead. And that really comes back to the whole model of leading as a servant, I think. And then the third stream of consciousness for me, about a dozen years ago, my wife and I thrust ourselves into some retail businesses that we never intended to be a part of, but that we have learned and grown to lead well. And in a retail environment where there is high turnover, to have a general manager manage a retail operation for more than about 18 months is pretty unusual. And we've got people that have been with us at this point for 10 years because we've learned some lessons together. So, you know, in the old movie, The Blues Brothers, the phrase is, hey, we're on a mission from God. In some respects, I feel like I'm on a mission from God to help managers understand they've got to be leaders.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think that is one of the most important things. We were talking a little bit about brands versus passion, but I think moving through life in a way where you're using your skills with your passion and your purpose, and all of those are in alignment, is what is our God-given gift and why we're here. So,
exactly.
Yeah.
Well, I love what you said, skills and passion and purpose, because you need to have a set of skills that can be used a number of different places. They come to life when you get to use those skills to help a team accomplish a worthwhile mission.
Yeah. So when somebody typically comes to you and finds you to figure out, you know, what they need to do you work through an assessment? Are you usually working with organizations and you're coming in, you're doing an assessment and saying, okay, these are the modalities that we need to institute?
Yeah, good question. I typically work a couple of different ways. I have historically for 25 years been your typical keynote speaker. I've been awarded the Certified Speaking Professional designation by the National Speakers Association. I'm supposed to be one of the best of the best. And so you over the years would have seen me up on the stage at association meetings or corporate meetings. The problem with that, Annika, is I get 45 minutes and you tell a couple of stories, you try to touch their head and their heart and give them something to remember. We have rescued golden retrievers for many years in our marriage, and the one little book that I've written that's become popular on Amazon is The Golden Principles, Life and Leadership Lessons from a Rescued Dog. I tell dog stories, and I'd like to believe that people walk away from their 45 minutes with me better. At my best, organizations ask me to come in and work alongside them for a significant period of time. And I partner with the Wiley organization to offer the DISC Work of Leaders assessment. And the interesting thing about that assessment is it is heavily research based. And the 4 leadership necessities that you and I have alluded to, and you're going to ask me to, I think, articulate a little bit more in a couple of minutes here, are measured by this assessment. And it gives me a great opportunity to help managers hold up a mirror to themselves. How am I doing in conviction? And how's that being communicated to the team that I lead? How am I doing demonstrating compassion and excellence in what I bring to the table? The whole character piece. People, you know, join organizations for the job, but they leave because of their boss. Am I being fair and honest and other oriented? The whole character piece. And then the final leadership necessity that we take a look at. It's an old-fashioned word that I think needs to be brought back into the 21st century, and it's the word covenant. Covenant is a combination of empathy and communication and alignment. It's really like here in the state of Texas where I live, they talk about marriage covenant, and a marriage covenant is both an exchange of love vows between a couple, but there's also a document that goes to the state of Texas that gets recorded as an official legal document. And the concept of covenant is both relational and formal in nature. And so as I started reflecting on what makes a good leader, I've had experiences with bad leaders. What makes a good leader? And my dissertation studies in this area, and really more, my practical work with organizations over the years really showed me the character and competence everybody talks about. And that's a given. This piece around passion that you and I've talked a little bit about is pretty important as well. And then I'd like us, as we maybe move forward, to talk also about this concept of covenant, because I think particularly in a post-COVID, but are we really post-COVID?
Right.
Work from home, return to work, great resignation, staffing shortages, Brene Brown and all of the other wonderful voices reminding us of the importance of empathy at the workplace. We've got to do some work around how we relate, and we still have organizational standards that have to be upheld. So that was kind of a rambling answer, but you can tell I'm passionate about this, right?
There are so many tangents that we could go off on based on what you just said too. I think where I'd like to start is, what is the difference between a manager and a leader? What are those skill sets? And then what are those leadership necessities that we alluded to?
Yeah. So, they end up getting defined a bunch of different ways. In my mind, the 4 leadership necessities become a taxonomy that managers can grab hold of. I work a great deal with frontline managers and managers of one-level teams where they've got 7 to 14 people underneath them. In fact, a year ago, they were one of those 7 to 14 people, and they've been promoted into their position of leadership. And part of what they've got to understand is, to be a leader now, I can't just do better what I did last quarter or last year. There's 4 things that I need to have my hands around. And as I mentioned a minute ago, let me go over them very crisply. The first one is conviction, this whole passion piece that you and I are going to talk about in a couple of minutes. The second one is competence, the ability to get a team to execute. Not just am I good, but is my team good? The third one is character, that whole area of other-oriented fair-mindedness. You're no longer the rising star. Your job is to make other people a star. You're rich in character and mature. And then the last of the 4 leadership necessities is this concept of covenant, where you are for them. You have a formal as well as a relational aspect. When I can help managers understand they've got to be working on those 4 areas, it is not just about now reading the team's spreadsheet each week or managing the Asana project from the administrator's level. Those, I would say, are management tasks, and they need to be done. Leadership is not in opposition to management, but no manager is automatically a leader until they step back and have a higher vision.
Yeah, I think that's such an important distinction. Often I think managers, when they're moving into leadership, they're still me focused. They're still worried about the job that they're doing individually, when, to your point, they need to be thinking about the team, because having the team working together really well propels everyone forward. It strengthens everything that they're trying to accomplish in their particular workflows. And it shows that they can actually be a leader and be a support system, a support person, and encourage people. And I mean, I've definitely seen good and bad examples of both management and leadership over the past couple of years in the work that I do. And it's always interesting to see and to realize from the outside,
Yeah, well, and it's interesting because your focus on branding and marketing and helping organizations with that, parallels the success of a sales organization, right? Because if you do well what you do well, you give them the tools and the language and the visibility to go in and sell. But what you said a minute ago is the classic example. I've worked with sales teams a lot through the years, and the top performing salesperson who is then promoted to a regional manager has got to learn a new set of skills, because it can't be about me anymore, as you mentioned a minute ago. And there are some mediocre salespeople who will make excellent sales managers,
right?
But it's hard for people to see that. So the typical thing that happens is the top performing salesperson gets promoted and they're not a team player. And that's just painful to see.
Yeah. So how do you change that? Are there techniques that organizations can look at to better identify people? I think that's one thing that we've also been discovering. I mean, even we were talking about, we're both adjunct professors at the university level, and I was just at an adjunct training over the weekend where we talked about, okay, they did away with the GRE. so they can get a bigger pool of students and find students who might actually be better matched to the program than just the ones who have the highest score, which attributes to,
Yeah.
okay, the person who is the top salesperson might not be the best manager or leader.
Yeah. That's exactly right. And by congratulations, it's so cool. USC is privileged to have you. That's great. And I particularly appreciate that you are a practitioner. You're not a professor who's been writing textbooks for the last 25 years. You're not for people. Yeah, and I think that is the challenge. Here's what I like to drive toward, though. The first job of a leader is always to lead themselves well. So leadership is at first a self-discipline, which means I've got to get better at the four things that Dr. Andy mentioned, at conviction, at competence, at character, and at covenant. How do I work on growing those areas? And so that brings you and me naturally to one of your areas of expertise, because this whole area of passion that really should, in some respects, define a brand. Mm-hmm. I don't think a leader can truly be a leader until they're ahead of the curve. They're thinking further out. They're thinking higher thoughts. Mm-hmm. They care more. One of my managers that reports to me today is a crier. And for the first several years she worked with me, she was embarrassed that she cried every time we had a hard conversation. And I communicated with her consistently, hey, tears aren't bad. They show me you care. And that's that passion piece. And so if somebody is promoted into a position of management, they've got to start thinking like an owner. They've got to start thinking about next year's bottom line and next season's trends. Frontline workers, think a week out, maybe a month out, depending upon the rhythm of their expectation, their project management or their sales cycle. Leaders need to be thinking further out than that and higher than that. That's that whole passion piece.
Yeah.
Theodore Hesburgh, president of Notre Dame University, said the first job of a leader is to inspire hope. You've got to get your people's eyes up. There is a bigger job that we're doing. I've got a young man in my life who sits at a coffee shop and writes code all day long. And I will tell you, that sounds like death to me. That's just like the worst thing I could imagine. But when you ask him and you really understand what he's doing, he is working on high speed, low latency video feed technology. I didn't even know what that meant until he defined it for me. What that means is you can bring Zoom sessions to third world countries to educate the poor who don't have access to good Wi-Fi. And all of a sudden, there's a reason why this work needs to be done.
Yeah,
that's the passion behind how do we write this code, right? Yeah. In fact, let me go a little bit further on my soapbox, because this whole leadership passion, I really do think I'm on a mission from God that I was kind of born with an itch to help bad managers become good managers. Totally apart from that, a dozen years ago, my best friend talked me into opening some swim schools here in Central Texas. Aquatots, we're a network of the largest network of franchise swim schools in the world. And my wife and I own 5 of them here in Central Texas. 13 years ago, I'm a lifetime swimmer. I like to water ski. We are beach people. But owning a swim school was a million miles away from my thinking. Yeah. And when my wife and I said yes to our good friend and brought Aquatots to Central Texas, passion started growing. In fact, I don't even want to share with your listeners the Google alerts that I get regularly, because Texas competes with your state, California, and Florida for the worst statistical award you'd want to win year in and year out. We've already had more than 55 children drown in Texas this year, and when you and I are recording this podcast, we're still in the summer of this year. We've got to get kids safe in the water. 13 years ago, that wasn't a passion of mine, but I dived into this business model, started hiring, training, recruiting, people that were passionate about swim skills and former swimmers and lifeguards and WSIs. And now I'm no longer just drinking their Kool-Aid. I am pouring the Kool-Aid. So I think an important point that I've learned that I want to emphasize for all of us is I do think there are some people that are just passionate. They wake up in the morning as world changers. There are also some people who dive deeply in, and when they dive deeply into a movement or a brand or a cause, they start drinking the Kool-Aid. And at some point, they believe it enough that they start pouring the Kool-Aid. Passion can grow. I guess that's the first thing that I would want to communicate to an emerging leader is you may not have that big picture yet, but do your work, get involved, look up as well as down, work with your peers, listen to your senior management, find industry trends, and I believe your passion will grow. So that's conviction.
Yeah. Well, and to that point, some of the things you mentioned earlier about the Great Resignation and how much we had to pivot during the pandemic and maybe the endemic period that we're in now. And I think, and one of the questions I wanted to ask you, but something I also saw in my own business was that organic change based on what I was passionate about and thinking, oh, I'm just going to have a PR agency for this. I've had many businesses, but for that particular business, and hiring people based on what I saw as commonalities, that they'd be great team members because of who they were as people and their convictions and their passion. And then realizing, oh, this person really doesn't want to do PR, but they have this other great skill set that we need on our team. So being able to pivot people to the right positions in the company, which then only helped us attract more clients that were in alignment with our values. But I think that's
and I think that ability to pivot, as you said, is so critical these days.
Yeah. And the people who aren't pivoting and the people who aren't able to turn that passion into something that fits, or I think I had my company, I ended up going to another company, I quit it because I realized that they are great at what they do, but it wasn't in alignment with my passion, my goals, and what I wanted to pursue in my career.
Well, and I think we all need to give ourselves permission, because the last 3 years have been like a 20-year shift, I suspect. And so, it's just a fast track. My wife and I picked up an off-lease SUV 6 months ago. That's a nice premium brand. It has a built-in navigation system. And we took it on a road trip over the last few weeks. And we discovered that when we're on the major highways, for the most part, it was just fine. But any roads that had been paved in the last 3 years, and this particularly was true when we get to a different city, the maps were out of date. And in some respects, it's ironic that those maps are out of date over the last 3 years because of what you just said, right? Things have changed so much. Here's the other lesson from that mapping software. When it finally righted itself and assured us that we were back on the right highway, it didn't apologize. It didn't hang its head. It didn't look back and tell itself how mistake-ridden it was. It just moved into the future. And I think part of what we all need to give ourselves permission to do is realize the rules have been rewritten in the last 3 years, and they're continuing to be rewritten. This concept of confident uncertainty. Hey, I'm going to push hard this direction. I've got a vision of this. It doesn't mean I'm a bad leader if I was wrong. It just means I've got to push the direction that makes sense today and tomorrow, because the rules have all been rewritten.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I know something that you often speak to is the dearth of good leaders. And I know, and I do a lot of nonprofit consulting and also a lot of nonprofit volunteering. And it's really hard. That I've seen the statistics and so many articles about executive directors are retiring and there's nobody to replace them. And I know that's not only the case for nonprofits, but also other corporations, finding good leaders, people who have the skill set and can move into the future. So what are some of your thoughts around that?
Well, I mean, you're partly to fault for this, or at least folks like you that are good at what they do and make us all realize social media can be a very powerful tool when it's used well. Social media, unfortunately, in some respects, the very definition of social media gives me the ability to promote myself. And unless you have a degree of maturity, you and I who spend time on social media every day, all of the messages we're getting are comparative messages with us to someone else, another person, another brand, another organization, which makes us feel insecure and self-focused. And I'm afraid at times the focus of that is in antithesis to a good leader. You know, the best definition of leadership, gosh, it's floated around. I wish I could attribute it to somebody, but about 50 different people have said it in their own version. The mark of a good leader is when you go away, nobody notices because the organization is so healthy without you. And I think the challenge, and gosh, I sure didn't mean to pick on you because, you know, I spent enough time poking around all your great branding stuff, but I think you know what I mean. The social media platforms tend to celebritize personalities when, you know, the invisible leader in some respects is the very best leader.
Yeah, that's a very interesting distinction, because I have volunteer organizations that are 100% volunteer and the leadership changes every year. And so in some ways you get 1 year to make your mark, but really you need to be thinking about the long-term legacy for the organization and how are you leaving it better than you found it? Not to say anything negative about what happened the year before, or the year before that, or the year before that.
Right.
But you know, that should be the goal of an organization like that. But then you have a lot of nonprofits and other companies that you associate with that one person. I mean, Steve Jobs, Apple, you know, Elon Musk, and other organizations. That how do you transcend that personal branding aspect?
Well, and I think that's a great point. And I love the names you just mentioned. I live in Austin, Texas. Elon Musk has changed our community in the last couple of years. And I suspect the verdict will be out on Elon Musk for at least another generation and a half. But the thing that I appreciate about Elon is his personal brand. At times, I'm absolutely convinced it is very calculated to push forward his vision of the future. I would say the same thing with Steve Jobs, where while it was all about Steve, Steve didn't make it all about him. He made it about creating amazingly beautiful, artistic, useful software and hardware. I've got a friend in the speaking world, Dr. Nito Cobain, who very successful businessman, multi-millionaire, was recruited to save a university that he'd been on the board of in the southeastern part of the United States. And they asked him to become president. He's invested his name into this university for, gosh, maybe 10 years now, and has turned High Point University around. And it's become a preeminent university in the Southeast. And I've spent enough time with Nito to know the whole point of him putting his name on that university and being the visible spokesperson and having access to boardrooms and corporate donors because of his reputation was to launch the school.
Wow.
And at some point he's going to retire and the school will go on. Did he bank on his social capital? You bet he did. But he used it for the good of the organization. And I would maintain Steve did that. I think Elon is doing that. You know, I think the verdict is still out on Bill Gates probably, but when you realize he's giving billions and billions to the organizations, the charitable organizations, the things that you're investing so much of your time in, he is using his big name and his social visibility to convince other billionaires to give away their wealth as well. That's the good use of a personal brand.
Absolutely. So how do we turn more managers into leaders, so who then can eventually lead these organizations where we're seeing, you know, not as big, not as robust of a pipeline, if you will? And again, to your point, with social media and everything else, sometimes it's so much easier for people to say, oh, I'm just going to go start something else instead of stay here for the long haul.
Yeah. Well, and that's where this 4 leadership necessities construct is not really something that I'm trying to convince good leaders of. It's really something that I've seen organically in good leaders. And the questions you've got is into, I think, particularly end up pointing toward the character and the covenant aspects of good leaders, and this leaders who serve, leaders who will use their strong passion, their strong vision, their capability, their ability to pull funds, their ability to speak to Wall Street. They'll do all of that, but they'll do that for the good of the organization that they're passionate about. And so, the whole area of character. Am I fair-minded? Am I other-oriented? Am I willing to take a back seat so others can have a front seat? At the end of the day, is it not about me? In some respects, the measure of the organizations, the nonprofits that you serve, if they only have a year to make an impact, the impact they need to make is inside the organization. So when they leave, other people continue to carry the mission forward. And that closely ties into the fourth leadership necessity, that area of covenant, where I think we need to be very careful in 2022. I like you, I spend a lot of time. I'm on LinkedIn. That's where my clients are. That's where I focus my energies. I think we just need to put words of caution around my business is my family. I appreciate the heart of that, but a business is not a family. Now, a business can have love inside. If we define love as acting in someone's best interest, which I think is a good definition of love, businesses should be full of love. Leaders should love their team members, but I prefer to have us view businesses as teams that are competing. And they're not even necessarily competing against their competition. They're competing against themselves and what they did last year or last quarter, or they're competing to become their best selves. If I had a concern with some of the trends that I see in social media in the marketplace these days, it is all about bring your heart to work. And man, I'm all about bringing your heart to work. I also know I own a little $5 million business. If you don't bring your work to work, I don't get to pay you next week. Right. And so there is this balance of I want you to feel good at work. And I also recognize that days work is a 4-letter word. I know you and I were corresponding earlier today, and it sounds like you've had kind of a whack-a-mole, bop the gopher kind of day. You've been racing from one thing to another. You've extended yourself to make today happen. That's work. And so the idea of covenant is I am here for you as a person, and we have a formal agreement and a formal arrangement that we're on a team together that's trying to accomplish something. That's the balance that I'm afraid is missing at times, at least in some of the podcasts I listen to and the blogs I read. It's you got to suck it up, Buttercup, a little bit, just a little bit.
And yeah, that idea of covenant, I think, particularly when you look at the Great Resignation and how people aren't these days, I know that as leaders of our organizations, we do bring a lot of empathy into work. During the pandemic, there were times that, I thought a team member would be well suited to be client facing, and found out that she had a lot of fear and anxiety around that, and that really wasn't her ideal work. Okay. So she wanted to quit. Rather than let her quit, I said, take a month off, do what you need to do to get back into a great state. And if you still want to work here, I would love to have you. Let's figure out what it can look like so that we both get what we need. Yeah. So I had to show a lot of empathy, but then I've also had people, just I think the number of issues and the way we handle them has changed over the last 3 years as well. And drawing that fine line between having empathy, but also making sure people are getting the work done so that money's still coming into the company, everybody gets paid, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that. Over the last 3 years, I've had more requests from clients to talk with leaders about holding hard conversations that are not harsh conversations, but they're still hard conversations. In fact, I think I mentioned it to you in some of our early correspondence. If your listeners are interested, I have a little ebook that I can make available to them, the 3 imperative leadership conversations. And the first one is having that type of conversation you just talked about, where, hey, the work still has to be done. We can't leave you in this position right now because you're not suited for it. It's not suited for you. Take a step back, figure out what you want. In the meantime, I've got to push forward with what needs to happen inside the firm. But let's revisit that again. You didn't just pick up the stapler and whack somebody on the thigh because you were having a bad day. And so that's that ability to have a hard conversation. I think that's a piece of artistry that good leaders have to learn.
Yeah, and it's not always easy or perfect, and sometimes we avoid it too, as leaders. But have you seen a difference in your work last few years with the more virtual environment in terms of how you work with the companies that you work with, how you deliver your speeches, but then also, is there more of a dissonance and disconnect between managers and leaders and workflows on virtual teams?
Yeah.
I know that's a lot of questions.
Great question. Yeah. Yes, I have. First of all, 2.5 years ago, all of a sudden I ended up morphing to coaching a number of leaders on how do you use Zoom? How do you use Teams? How do you use WebEx? And, the first rule of leadership is you are a step ahead of your team. Turn your camera on. You're not allowed to hold a meeting where you're not on camera. Even if they're not on camera, you're in charge, my goodness. Figure out, work with somebody that can help you get a camera and figure out how to plug it into your laptop. So I ended up doing a whole bunch of that, 24 months ago. I found myself as presentations virtual coach, but it went further than that. To your point, the virtual meeting, I'm not even going to say it's a bad medium. It is just a different medium. For instance, you and I are having a wonderful conversation on Zoom with both our cameras on right now. If you and I were at a conference room, we'd be sitting in chairs where we'd be probably 4 to 5 feet apart. I'm 18 inches from my camera. You're 18 inches from your camera. I can see your eyes closer than I would if I was sitting in a conference room in Southern California. And so there's an intimacy that can come that leaders need to use well. One of the simple tools that I coach a number of people on is grab a visual of a traffic light. There's free traffic light visuals on Unsplash or Pexels or any number of those free download nice visuals websites. Put it on the screen behind you and start your meeting off by saying, hey, before we dive into our 12 issues, can we just take a minute and do a red light, yellow light, green light? How are you today? And that allows your people to share at whatever level they were comfortable sharing. I've been part of these meetings where it was, man, everything's fine, green light, green light, green light. I've also been at these meetings where one of my subordinate managers just had a really, really bad day. And she'd been working in her home office on her own for a number of days. And she needed some of that heart side of the covenant expressed by our leadership team. And we gave all of us permission to love her in the way you and I've defined love. And so that simply became a simple tool that I started recommending to people that were leading meetings. Get a traffic light up, red light, yellow light, green light, and take the first 10 minutes to do that temperature check. Because the problem is you didn't get to do that in the hallway as you stopped at the water machine and headed into the conference room. So let's purposely take some time. Things like that show you are still committed to expressing that heart side of the covenant you have with your people.
And when you're helping turn managers into leaders and working with these companies, or even when you've given a speech, what is a big aha moment or some, either in working with a specific company, you don't need to name companies, don't want to have you breach any confidentiality, or when you've given a speech, somebody came up and said, wow, that really impacted me. And here is how I'm rethinking leadership.
Yeah. Well, I think probably a couple of things. I am bold enough to talk about character issues in the marketplace. And those are uncomfortable conversations at times. James Coos and Barry Posner have been publishing the Leadership Challenge for decades at this point. It's a research-based leadership. It's actually not a leadership study. It's a followership study. Why would you choose to follow someone? And they've cataloged more than 2 dozen character traits, honesty, fair-mindedness, other-orientedness, hard-workingness, things like that, that followers say, this is why I would choose to follow a leader. And we end up talking about those. If there's typically you can hear a pin drop in the boardroom when I am sitting at a conference table with 12 managers. It's when we talk about that you'll never be a better leader than you are a person. And if you're cheating on your expense account because nobody's going to know if that Uber was 38 or if you gave them a $10 tip and you put down 48, but it changes the way you think about money and your money versus the company's money. That is not uncomfortable for me because I'm passionate about it, but that's when the boardroom gets very quiet.
Yeah. Wow. That's interesting.
Second area is the whole area of covenant that you and I've talked about. It's an interesting word, and to challenge people to recognize that businesses are teams, they're not families. There's a formal component as well as a heart component. And how do you and I as managers and leaders let our people know we are there for them while we still honor the stewardship responsibility to deliver a profit or to fulfill the mission. If it's a nonprofit, we've got to have a sustainability to it. I've taught all of our managers at the small swim school business, guys. I talk with you a lot about numbers, not because I'm a numbers driven person. I talk to you about numbers because numbers are the very best measurement to allow us to know we get to do this again next month and next quarter and next year. And so that's why we talk about the formal side of things.
Yeah. And I think that transparency also is appreciated by our team members because they know that they are part of the team and they need to be as invested as we are in many ways.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly. So character and covenant, I think, are keys for effective managers to become leaders, along with conviction and competence.
Absolutely. And we will, of course, have how to get in touch with you and your website and materials linked in all of the show notes. But I'd love to find out, is there anything that we didn't cover, or is there one key takeaway that you want listeners to think about when they're thinking about the difference between managers and high-performing leaders?
Yeah. Well, I think the whole point of passion, of recognizing I don't have to be born with passion, but I need to see the greater good. Yeah. I need to take a step back and take some time to reflect and remember again the important work we're doing, the important team we're building, the important impact we're having. I think probably that would be one of the things that I'd want to emphasize. As I shared a few minutes ago, I've worked a lot with sales teams over the years, and getting a sales performer to recognize now it's about the organization's success. It's about how many medical devices can we make available for patients that need new shoulders or new knees or whatever it is. It's not just about me making the biggest bonus I can this quarter. I think that's a big one. And then if I had to strip it down, I think my heart says the character of a leader. I've just worked for enough bad bosses that I saw they made it about themselves, right? And how do we change that messaging in a social media world that is doing everything it can at times to create the celebrity of leadership rather than the selflessness of leadership?
Yeah, it's important. And Dr. Andy, do you have a favorite quote or a mantra that you'd like to share with the audience today?
Well, we turned managers into leaders became one of my favorites. I think that the quote I shared probably 25 minutes ago, you'll never be a better leader than you are a person. I'm just absolutely convinced that's true. I think there's been some very effective leaders, but I hate to call them leaders because they were bad people. Yeah. And the ultimate outcome, whether it's the next fiscal year or whether it's a generation later in that country, the ultimate outcome was not good for the people that they were supposed to be leading well. So you'll never be a better a better leader than you are a person. And probably, again, I'm not the first to say it, 10,000 people have said it, but as leaders go, so go their organizations. It's all dependent upon, can you and I lead well? Your students at USC are going to get the benefit of that as you talk with them about branding and marketing, and the folks that I get to talk to in my podcasts and my speeches and the books I write. Your job and my job is to make them better so that they can make their organizations better.
Absolutely. Well, this has been a really beautiful conversation. I have so many notes of things that we could continue talking about. We'll have to regroup and have another conversation down the road and lift up some more of those questions and get more into your books and some of the other wonderful things that you do.
Excellent. Excellent. You bet. And I'll make those resources available, particularly that ebook on the 3 imperative leadership conversations: how to hold a hard conversation, how to hold a coaching conversation, and then how to hold a threefold affirmation conversation. So anybody's interested, you and I will make sure they have the link to that. Thank you for the privilege of spending some time with you. I'm an admirer of your work. And when you said, yeah, let's spend some time together, it just thrilled me. I really appreciate the privilege of speaking to your listeners.
Thank you so much. I just appreciate you so much. And we're definitely kindred spirits on so much of this. So I always love having people on who are experts in their field and can share things with our audience that really people need to consider as you're growing your business and thinking about what your next step is for your businesses. How can you be successful? And Dr. Andy has set out 4 really great objectives and characteristics, character traits for everybody to pay attention to. So we'll make sure the book is in the show notes as well. And thank you to our audience for coming back for another week of Your Brand Amplified. And I will be back again next week with another amazing guest.